Threx lay motionless beneath the ash-filled sky, his once mighty frame now reduced to a skeletal, trembling form. The air was thick with the scent of burned metal and decay, and his body ached from wounds that had long since stopped bleeding. Dried blood caked his matted fur, his massive claws dull and chipped. Hunger gnawed at him, but even that felt distant compared to the hollowness in his heart. The Gorhak, his creators, the ones who had engineered him for war, had left him to die here. Memories of his time in their service flashed in his mind. Threx had once been a commander, leading raids with precision, tearing through enemy lines with savage efficiency. The Gorhak had praised him, calling him their greatest weapon. His loyalty was unquestioned. He fought, he killed, and he protected because that was his purpose. It was all he had ever known. But wars don't end in glory. They end in treaties, in handshakes, in peace that had no place for beings like him. And so, the Gorhak discarded him. They didn't need him anymore. The war had ended, and Threx was no longer useful. Left alone on a dying planet, abandoned like the rusted machines scattered across the wasteland, Threx's existence had become one of survival, not purpose. His sharp senses were dulled, his once towering form now slouched and weakened, every step a reminder of the creators who had left him to rot. His breath was shallow, his ribs cracked, but he didn't have time to linger on his pain. Threx's instincts kicked in as a rodent darted by, its small body a faint flicker of life in this desolate place. With practiced movement, he snatched it in his jaws, crushing it quickly. The taste of blood, though faint, reminded him that he was still alive. He chewed slowly, savoring what little nourishment it offered. The battlefield around him had been silent for years. The roar of engines, the clash of steel, and the cries of fallen soldiers were now only echoes carried by the wind. He had once been part of that chaos, an unstoppable force on the battlefield. Now, he was nothing but a forgotten relic, a ghost haunting a world that no longer cared for him. Despite the pain, despite the loneliness, something still burned inside Threx. He wasn't ready to die, not yet. His creators had abandoned him, yes, but he would not abandon himself. He shifted, pushing through the agony in his limbs, forcing his body to move. The ruins around him stretched for miles, a graveyard of war, and yet, somewhere in the distance, he could sense life. The fire inside him was dim, but it was still there. Threx wouldn't go quietly into the void. He had survived the worst the galaxy had to offer. He would survive this too, even if it meant clawing his way through the dirt for another day. The hunger for life was stronger than the pain. And even in his darkest moments, Threx knew he wasn't defeated. Not yet. As the horizon blurred before him, he stumbled but regained his footing. There was no glory left for him here, no cause to fight for, but there was survival. And for now, that was enough. The human crew descended from their ship, scanning the barren landscape. The planet was desolate, a graveyard of ancient wars fought and forgotten. Captain Daniels led the team, his face set with determination. They were here on a routine mission, tasked with documenting relics from the Gorhak conflict. This planet had been the site of countless battles, and the ruins were filled with remnants of a brutal history. They didn't expect to find anything alive. As they ventured deeper into the ruins, something caught their attention. Amidst the rubble, a form stirred, a creature barely clinging to life, half buried beneath debris. It was massive, its once powerful body now skeletal and weak. The team hesitated, recognizing the unmistakable features of the Vgar. The stories of these creatures were legendary. Engineered for war, they had been the scourge of the galaxy, feared for their lethal efficiency. Seeing one here, so close to death, was both shocking and unsettling. The crew exchanged uneasy glances. They had heard too many tales of the Vgar's savagery. Fear rippled through the group. What if this creature still had fight left in it? What if it attacked? Captain Daniels held up a hand, signaling them to stay back. His mind raced. The protocol was clear: approach with caution or not at all. Yet something tugged at him. This Vgar was no longer the fearsome beast of war. It was barely alive. Dr. Lara Bennett, the team's medic, stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the creature. We can't just leave it like this, she said, her voice firm despite the tension in the air. The rest of the crew looked at her in disbelief. They knew what the Vgar were capable of. It's not a threat to us right now. It's dying. Captain Daniels frowned, torn between his duty and the empathy stirring inside him. The logical choice would be to walk away. This creature had no place in the new peace the galaxy had built. But Dr. Bennett's conviction was unwavering. She knelt beside the Vgar, examining its wounds. The creature was in bad shape, deep gashes, exposed bone, layers of dried blood. Yet, as she worked, it didn't resist. It stirred slightly, but there was no aggression, no mindless rage. Just exhaustion. Bennett continued to tend to its wounds, her touch gentle yet efficient. She knew what the crew was thinking, but she didn't care. This wasn't about fear or caution anymore. It was about doing what was right. The Vgar's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment they met hers. In that brief exchange, she saw something that surprised her, a flicker of understanding. It wasn't the mindless beast she had expected. There was intelligence there, perhaps even a sliver of trust. The rest of the crew remained on edge, hands hovering near their weapons, unsure whether to intervene or let Bennett continue. Captain Daniels watched the scene unfold, wrestling with his instincts. He had to make a choice, and fast. If the creature lashed out, it could be over for all of them. But it didn't. It lay still, its breathing shallow, its body broken. Dr. Bennett worked quickly, disinfecting the wounds and bandaging them as best as she could. Every now and then, the creature shifted slightly, a low groan escaping its throat, but there was no aggression in its movements. She spoke softly to it, knowing full well that the Vgar couldn't understand her words. Yet her tone was calm, reassuring. Captain Daniels sighed, his hesitation fading. "We help it," he said, breaking the silence. The crew looked at him in surprise. "We don't leave anything behind, not even this." His decision was final. They had made contact with the last thing the galaxy wanted to remember, and yet they couldn't turn their backs now. Bennett nodded, grateful. She continued her work, her hands moving with precision, but her thoughts were racing. This creature was a relic of a bygone era, discarded like so many other weapons of war. And yet here it was, not just alive, but showing something she hadn't expected: vulnerability. As the humans watched, their fear began to give way to something else. This wasn't the terrifying monster they had been led to believe the Vgar were. It was suffering, yes, but there was more to it. Bennett could see that now, and perhaps the rest of the crew was starting to see it too. Threx, in his weakened state, began to understand something as well. These weren't his creators. They weren't the Gorhak. They didn't treat him like a tool or a weapon. Their touch was careful, their voices soft. They weren't controlling him. They were helping him. It was a strange feeling for a creature bred for war. The crew, though still cautious, slowly began to accept the situation. They had encountered something unexpected, something they had feared, but also something they couldn't ignore. This Vgar, once a symbol of destruction, was now a being in need of their compassion. Captain Daniels glanced at Bennett, then back at the creature lying before them. "We move it to the ship," he said, his voice steady now. "We're not leaving it here." The crew gathered their gear, their earlier fear replaced by a cautious resolve. The decision had been made. Threx lay in the quiet corner of the ship's medical bay, his body still aching but no longer on the verge of collapse. Days had passed since the humans had taken him in, and slowly he began to recover. Dr. Bennett was relentless in her care, ensuring his wounds were treated and his strength returned. At first, Threx had been wary of their every move. His instincts had trained him to expect hostility, to brace for control or pain, but there was none of that here. The humans didn't force him, didn't restrain him. They brought him food, water, and care. They spoke in soft tones that carried no commands, only concern. He didn't trust them right away. Years of battle had taught him that trust was a dangerous thing. But as the days passed, his body started to heal, and so did something deeper inside him. The humans were consistent in their actions. They didn't treat him like a mindless weapon. They treated him as if his survival mattered. And slowly he began to respond. Threx learned to communicate with them in ways he hadn't anticipated. When Dr. Bennett brought him food, he nudged her hand gently, indicating when he wanted more or when his water dish was empty. His movements were cautious but deliberate, testing the boundaries of this new connection. When someone approached too quickly, he would raise his head slightly, signaling his discomfort, and they would slow their pace. The humans noticed, and more importantly, they respected his signals. This wasn't something he had ever experienced with the Gorhak. The crew, initially wary of the alien war dog in their midst, began to see beyond the stories they had heard. Threx wasn't just some monstrous relic from a forgotten war. He was a living being, and more than that, he was intelligent, capable of understanding them. They watched him with a mixture of awe and caution as he responded to their presence with small but significant gestures. There was no wild savagery, no violent outbursts. Threx was not the creature they had feared, but something far more complex. As he healed, Threx had time to reflect on his situation. The humans were nothing like his creators, the Gorhak. They didn't see him as a tool to be used and discarded. They had no expectations of violence or control. Instead, they treated him with a strange kindness, one he had never known before. It confused him at first, but as his wounds closed and his strength returned, he began to understand. These humans didn't need him to fight. They simply wanted to help him. The thought was foreign, but it stirred something in him, a sense of belonging that had been absent for so long. One day, as Dr. Bennett tended to a deep scar along his side, Threx felt a sharp jolt of pain. His muscles tensed, and for a moment, old instincts flared. But instead of reacting with aggression, he leaned forward and nudged her shoulder gently, a soft touch with the side of his muzzle. It was an instinctive gesture, not of threat but of trust. Dr. Bennett froze for a moment, unsure if he was about to lash out. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw something else: gratitude. It was a small moment, but it felt significant. Threx had never shown this kind of vulnerability before, not even to his creators. But here, with these humans, something was different. He felt safe in a way he hadn't expected. Dr. Bennett smiled softly, her hand resting on his scarred fur for just a moment longer than necessary. That touch, brief as it was, solidified the bond between them. The rest of the crew noticed the shift as well. Threx was no longer just a patient, nor was he a threat they had to manage. He was becoming part of the crew, in a way none of them had anticipated. Conversations about him changed from cautious whispers to open curiosity. They began to see him not as a war machine, but as something much more, a sentient being capable of emotion, thought, and even loyalty. Threx, for his part, watched them closely. He observed their behaviors, their mannerisms, the way they spoke to each other and to him. The humans didn't carry the same cold efficiency that the Gorhak had. They joked, they laughed, they worried. And most importantly, they cared. Not just for him, but for each other. It was a strange dynamic, one Threx had never experienced in his life of war and service. But it was one he found himself drawn to. His recovery continued at a pace that surprised even Dr. Bennett. The Vgar biology was advanced, engineered for resilience in the harshest conditions. But even so, Threx's rapid healing was remarkable. With each passing day, he grew stronger, his once weak and broken body regaining its former power. Yet the strength he gained wasn't just physical. He was changing in other ways, too. The humans, whether they realized it or not, had given Threx something he hadn't known he needed: companionship. It wasn't the forced camaraderie of his old pack, driven by orders and a shared purpose of destruction. This was different. It was more genuine, more personal. Threx was starting to feel a loyalty to these humans, not because they commanded it, but because they had earned it. He had never expected to find this among a species he had once viewed as inferior, as prey to be hunted. But these humans, they were unlike anything he had encountered before. They didn't just fight, they cared. And that care had awakened something in him. Threx wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. And for the first time in his existence, he realized that there was more to life than following orders, more to being than just being a weapon. These humans had shown him that. And in doing so, they had earned something more powerful than fear or strength. They had earned his trust. As the crew continued to explore the ruins, sifting through the debris of a long-forgotten war, they stumbled upon something unexpected. Hidden deep within the wreckage was a data cache, heavily encrypted and bearing the marks of the Gore Hack's war code. Intrigued, they set to work, eager to uncover the secrets the Gore Hack had left behind. Hours of decrypting data revealed something astonishing. The Vgar were not simply engineered for war. They had been designed with a deeper purpose, originally meant to be protectors and peacekeepers, not mere instruments of destruction. The realization hit hard. The Vgar, creatures like Threx, were never meant to be the monsters the galaxy feared. Their creators had twisted their purpose, bending them to the will of war and conquest. This information had been hidden, buried beneath layers of propaganda and suppression, but now the truth was in the hands of the human crew. Word of the discovery spread quickly. It wasn't long before the Galactic Council, always watching, caught wind of the data the humans had uncovered. The Council had long sought to erase the Vgar from existence, to bury the truth of what they were created for. A message came through, urgent and cold: the humans were to turn Threx over immediately. The Council had no interest in explanations or negotiations. Threx, like the rest of his kind, was a threat to their carefully constructed peace. Refusal would lead to consequences far beyond the crew's control. Captain Daniels stood at the center of the ship's command room, the weight of the Council's demands heavy on his shoulders. Around him, the crew debated furiously. Some argued that they couldn't afford to defy the Council. They were a small crew, a single ship, and the Council's power stretched across the galaxy. To go against them would be suicide. Others, led by Dr. Bennett, stood firm. Threx had proven himself. He was no mindless killer, no threat. He had shown loyalty, intelligence, and even compassion. Turning him over now, knowing what they knew, would be an act of betrayal. Daniels knew what was at stake. If they handed Threx over, the Council would destroy him without hesitation. He was a loose end, a relic of a past the galaxy wanted to forget. But if they didn't, they would be painting a target on their own backs. The decision felt impossible, the moral weight pressing down on him from all sides. As the crew argued, Threx sensed the tension. He could feel the unease in the air, the way the humans moved with a subtle urgency, their voices sharp with anxiety. His instincts flared, but this wasn't the same fear of battle he had known before. This was something different. It was personal. These humans were his pack now, and whatever danger was coming, it threatened them as much as it threatened him. Threx rose to his full height, still not completely healed but strong enough. He moved to where the crew stood, his presence alone enough to quiet the room. There was no mistaking the intelligence in his eyes as he scanned the faces of the humans he had come to trust. He didn't need to understand their words to know what was happening. They were being forced to choose between him and their own safety, and Threx was not about to let them suffer for his sake. He stepped forward, positioning himself protectively near Dr. Bennett, his body language clear. He wasn't going anywhere. He would stand with them, fight if he had to, not because he was ordered to but because he chose to. The crew, seeing this act of loyalty, fell silent. Even those who had doubted him now hesitated. Threx had proven himself. He wasn't just a weapon. He was one of them. Captain Daniels locked eyes with Dr. Bennett. She didn't have to say a word. He already knew what she was thinking. The choice was no longer just about survival. It was about doing what was right. Threx had earned their trust, and abandoning him now would be more than a betrayal. It would be a stain on their own morality. Daniels made his decision. "We're not handing him over," he said, his voice calm but resolute. The crew looked at him in shock, but no one spoke up to challenge him. They had crossed a line, one that they couldn't return from. The Galactic Council would come for them now, and when they did, it would be with overwhelming force. But Daniels had made his peace with that. He wasn't about to let Threx, or the truth they had uncovered, fall back into the hands of those who wanted to erase it. The ship was quickly abuzz with preparation. They knew what was coming. The Council wouldn't take no for an answer, and when they arrived, it would be with enough firepower to turn their ship to scrap. But they wouldn't go down without a fight. Every crew member understood the risks now. They were defying the galaxy's most powerful authority, but they weren't doing it for glory or out of some misplaced sense of rebellion. They were doing it for Threx. Threx moved through the ship, his senses sharp as the humans armed themselves and fortified their positions. He understood now. They weren't just fighting for him, they were fighting for each other. This was a pack, not bound by force or fear, but by choice. And that meant something more than any battle he had ever fought. Daniel stood at the helm, watching the stars, waiting for the inevitable. He knew the Council would come, but he also knew that they were more than ready. These weren't just explorers anymore. They were a crew united by a cause, and that made them dangerous in ways the Council couldn't anticipate. The alarms sounded. Council ships had entered the system, and the final confrontation was upon them. The ship rattled as the Galactic Council forces began their assault. A barrage of laser fire hammered the shields, shaking the hull with each impact. Council ships had surrounded them, and the crew knew they were vastly outnumbered. There was no turning back now. The Council wasn't just here to negotiate. They were here to eliminate Threx, and anyone who stood in their way. The tension in the air was palpable as the crew moved quickly, preparing for the inevitable boarding. They had fortified the ship as best as they could, but they knew it would only be a matter of time before the Council agents breached their defenses. The odds were stacked against them, but they weren't fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for something much bigger, the truth. Threx stood near the entrance to the cargo bay, his body tense and ready. His wounds hadn't fully healed, but he had never felt stronger. This wasn't just another battle for him. This was different. He wasn't fighting because someone commanded him to. He was fighting for his new family. These humans had risked everything for him, and now, he would do the same for them. His loyalty to them was fierce, and that loyalty gave him a strength he hadn't known before. The first wave of Council agents breached the ship, cutting through the hull with ruthless efficiency. They poured into the corridors, weapons drawn, prepared to take out anything in their path. But they weren't expecting what came next. Threx moved like a blur, his powerful body a force of nature as he tore through the first line of attackers. His claws slashed through armor, his jaws crushing weapons before they could be fired. His movements were precise, driven by years of combat experience, but this time, there was something more behind his actions. He wasn't just a weapon anymore. He was fighting for the humans who had saved him. The crew, though smaller in number, fought back with everything they had. Their ingenuity and familiarity with the ship's layout gave them an edge. They worked in perfect synchronization with Threx, using his raw power to complement their tactical maneuvers. Whenever a Council agent pushed too far, Threx was there, intercepting them with terrifying speed. And whenever Threx needed backup, the humans were right behind him, their rifles blazing. It was a battle of sheer will. The Council had numbers and firepower on their side, but the bond between Threx and the crew was undeniable. Each time an agent fell, the crew pushed forward with renewed determination. They weren't just defending a ship, they were defending a member of their family. The Council had underestimated the strength of that unity, and it was costing them. Amidst the chaos, Captain Daniels knew they had a crucial task to complete. They couldn't just fight, they needed to broadcast the truth. The data they had uncovered about the Vgar couldn't stay hidden any longer. The galaxy needed to know what the Council had buried, and this was their only chance. As the battle raged on, a small team worked tirelessly in the command center, uploading the decrypted files to every communication network they could access. It was a race against time. Council ships continued their assault, trying to jam the ship's signals, but the crew worked with relentless focus. Finally, a message flashed on the screen, transmission sent. The truth was out. Across the galaxy, the revelation would spread like wildfire. The Vgar weren't mindless killers. They were protectors, manipulated by the very forces that now sought to destroy them. Public opinion would shift, and the Council's hold on power would weaken. But the battle wasn't over. The Council forces, realizing the broadcast had gone out, launched their final assault. The ship shook violently as agents began boarding en masse, determined to take control. The crew was pushed to their limits, their defenses faltering under the sheer weight of the attack. But even as they faced impossible odds, they held the line. Threx, though battered and bloodied, refused to back down. His muscles ached, his wounds reopened, but he kept fighting. He had been abandoned once, left to die by those who saw him as nothing more than a tool. But these humans, they had seen him for who he truly was. And now, he would protect them with everything he had. Just when it seemed like the tide was turning against them, reinforcements arrived. Ships from sympathetic colonies, independent human factions, and even a few Gar who had survived in hiding joined the fray. They had seen the broadcast, and they weren't going to let the Council silence the truth. The balance of power shifted as the reinforcements tipped the scales in favor of the humans. Council ships were forced to retreat, their agents overwhelmed by the sudden influx of new allies. The battle, brutal and exhausting, finally ended. The Council ships fled the system, their once unshakable grip on the galaxy weakened by the truth. The human crew, though battered and weary, stood victorious. Threx limped back to Dr. Bennett's side, his body covered in fresh wounds, but there was still a fire in his eyes. He had fought for something greater than himself, and he had won. Dr. Bennett knelt beside him, resting her hand gently on his fur. She didn't need to say anything. The bond between them spoke louder than words. Threx, once a tool of war, had become something more, a protector, a friend, and a symbol of hope. As the dust settled and the ship began to repair the damage, the crew gathered, looking out into the stars. They had done more than just survive a battle. They had changed the course of galactic history. The truth about the Vgar was now known, and with it, the possibility of a future where beings like Threx weren't feared, but understood. Threx stood tall beside them, no longer a weapon, but a part of something bigger. The humans had defied the odds, fought against tyranny, and triumphed. And in doing so, they had forged a bond that would endure, one built on loyalty, compassion, and the undeniable truth that sometimes, the greatest strength lies not in power, but in unity.